There was a 16-year-old girl named Ruth. Ruth lived in a small town with her father and stepmother. Ruth's mother had passed away a few years ago. Her father loved her very much, but he was often away for work. Ruth's stepmother, Mrs. Evelyn, was not kind to her. She made Ruth do most of the chores around the house. She would often yell at her and blame her for things that weren't her fault. Ruth felt sad and lonely, but she tried to stay strong. Ruth's stepmother was a perfectionist and expected Ruth to meet her impossible standards in everything she did. Whether it was washing the dishes, dusting the furniture, or folding laundry, Ruth's efforts never seemed good enough. Even the smallest speck of dust or a dish not perfectly clean would set Evelyn off. Evelyn had a strict set of rules, and any deviation from them would result in punishment. Ruth tried her best to comply with the rules. One day, while trying to carry a tray of dishes to the kitchen, Ruth accidentally stumbled over a loose rug. The dishes clattered to the ground and shattered, echoing loudly through the house. Evelyn stormed into the room, her face twisted with anger. "You useless child," she yelled, raising her hand to slap Ruth. "You can't do anything right." Ruth braced herself, tears welling up in her eyes. The sting of the slap was sharp, but what hurt even more was the constant emotional abuse. She tried to hold back her tears, knowing that crying would only make things worse. As Evelyn berated Ruth, the young girl felt a mix of fear and anger. She longed for an escape from her miserable situation, but had nowhere to turn. Ruth's heart grew heavier with each passing day, but she clung to the hope that one day she would find a way out of the darkness and into the light. Ruth's mother passed away when Ruth was just 8 years old, leaving her and her father heartbroken. The loss of her mother left a deep void in her life that seemed impossible to fill. Her father, then solely responsible for raising his young daughter, struggled to balance his work with his new parental duties. Few years after Ruth's mother's death, her father remarried to Evelyn. Evelyn appeared to be a kind and gentle person. She had known the family for some time and seemed eager to help bring stability back into their lives. Initially, Evelyn treated Ruth with warmth and care, trying to be a nurturing presence in her life. Ruth found the transition difficult, missing her mother deeply, but she appreciated Evelyn's efforts and slowly began to trust her stepmother. However, everything changed when Evelyn gave birth to her own child. Almost overnight, her demeanor towards Ruth shifted. Evelyn's attention and affection focused solely on her own child, leaving Ruth feeling neglected and pushed aside. The once caring stepmother became cold and distant towards her, prioritizing her own child above all else. Ruth felt hurt and abandoned by her stepmother's sudden change in behavior. Her father, too, noticed the shift but seemed hesitant to confront Evelyn directly. Ruth found herself missing her mother more than ever, feeling isolated in her own home. Evelyn's constant criticism toward Ruth weighed heavily on the young girl's heart. Each day, as she endured her stepmother's harsh words, she found herself withdrawing further into herself. Evelyn would often compare Ruth to her late mother, claiming she inherited her mother's weaknesses and shortcomings. Ruth would sit quietly, biting her lip as Evelyn's harsh words echoed in her ears. It hurt her deeply, but she knew that arguing back would only lead to more trouble. Instead, she tried to prove Evelyn wrong by working harder around the house, hoping to gain some approval. Yet, no matter how much effort Ruth put in, Evelyn remained unimpressed. Her help around the house was met with more critiques. Evelyn's words cut deeper each time she spoke, leaving Ruth feeling lost and helpless. Ruth often sought solace in her mother's old room, a place Evelyn rarely visited. There she would sit among her mother's belongings, finding comfort in the memories of the woman she barely remembered. It was in those quiet moments that Ruth would remind herself that she was not useless and that she had the strength to rise above Evelyn's negativity. Ruth began to dream of a life away from her stepmother's oppressive grip. Ruth moved slowly down the dusty road, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to carry out her task. Her heart ached with sadness, making every step seem heavier. She couldn't seem to stop crying, her vision blurred by her emotions. As she walked, Ruth didn't notice the figure approaching from the other direction. It was a woman, her face lined with compassion. When she saw the young girl crying on the road, her heart went out to her. The woman stepped closer and gently asked, "Oh dear, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" Ruth looked up, her face wet with tears. Ruth spoke in a soft voice, sharing the heartbreaking truth with the woman. "I don't go to school because my stepmother sends me out to hawk as soon as my father leaves for work. I can't tell my father because I'm afraid she will hurt me if she finds out," she said, her eyes downcast. The woman's heart softened for the young girl standing before her. She could see the fear and pain in Ruth's eyes, and she knew she had to do something. "Dear, I'm so sorry you're going through this," the woman said gently. "No child should have to face such hardship. Have you ever tried speaking to your father about this?" Ruth shook her head. "I want to, but I'm scared he won't believe me. Or worse, that my stepmother will hurt me for telling him." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and the woman could sense the depth of her fear. The woman nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your fear, dear, but I want you to know that you don't have to face this alone. Let me help you. We can figure out a way to talk to your father safely, and maybe even find a way for you to go back to school." Ruth looked at the woman, hope beginning to glimmer in her eyes. "Can you really help me?" she asked. "Yes, I promise I'll do everything I can to help you," the woman assured her. "Let's work together to find a solution that will keep you safe and give you the education you deserve." Ruth was intrigued when the woman she met on the road expressed an interest in visiting her home to talk to her father. The woman, Mrs. Grace, seemed kind and well-intentioned, and Ruth appreciated the offer to help. She decided to arrange a meeting between Mrs. Grace and her father when he would be at home. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the doorbell rang, and Ruth welcomed Mrs. Grace into their cozy home. Ruth's father, Adams, was waiting in the living room and greeted Mrs. Grace warmly. He had heard from Ruth about the woman who wanted to speak with him. Once they were all seated, Mrs. Grace started the conversation by explaining her intentions. Mrs. Grace told Mr. Adams that she was deeply concerned for his daughter's well-being. She believed Ruth would benefit from changing environment. Mrs. Grace proposed that Ruth stay with her for a while, where she could provide a safe, nurturing environment and additional opportunities for growth and education. Mr. Adams listened thoughtfully as Mrs. Grace spoke. He expressed his concerns about being separated from Ruth, as she was his beloved child, and he cherished their time together. Mrs. Grace reassured him that this arrangement wouldn't be permanent, and that Ruth would have the chance to visit home regularly. Ruth also participated in the conversation, acknowledging the challenges her father faced, but expressing her apprehension about leaving home. Mrs. Grace gently explained that it could be an opportunity for Ruth to gain new experiences and grow in ways she might not be able to otherwise. After a long and thoughtful discussion, Mr. Adams agreed to the idea on the condition that Ruth could return home whenever she wished. Mrs. Grace agreed to these terms and promised to keep in close contact with Mr. Adams during Ruth's stay. Ruth thanked her father for his support and understanding. They agreed to move forward with the arrangement, and Mrs. Grace left with plans to return the next day to take Ruth to her home. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ruth's life. Evelyn had always been a controlling and possessive person, and the presence of Ruth in her life as a stepdaughter had triggered deep-seated feelings of resentment and rivalry. Ruth was young, vibrant, and full of potential, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel overshadowed by her presence. Ruth's departure from the house had finally come, a moment Evelyn had been waiting for since she first learned of Ruth's existence in her marriage. As Ruth packed her belongings and made her way out the door, Evelyn watched with a mixture of relief and satisfaction. In her mind, Ruth's presence had been a constant reminder of her husband's previous life and relationships. With Ruth gone, she could now fully claim her role as the head of the household without any perceived competition. As Ruth stepped out of the house, Evelyn felt a weight lifted off her shoulders. She smiled to herself, relishing the newfound peace and quiet that would soon fill the house. Evelyn was ready to embrace a life without Ruth, envisioning a home that revolved solely around her and her desires. Grace took Ruth back to their mansion in a rich neighborhood. As they entered, Ruth was struck by the warmth and charm of the house. The living room was tastefully decorated with family photos and vibrant plants, giving the space a sense of life and homeliness. Grace's husband, Mark, was waiting in the living room with a welcoming smile. He was a tall, friendly man with a calm demeanor. He greeted Ruth warmly, offering her a seat on the comfortable couch. Evelyn quickly fetched some refreshments. The couple made Ruth feel at ease, engaging her in light-hearted conversation. They asked her about her plans and her interests. Ruth appreciated their genuine interest and kindness, feeling a sense of relief after her long journey. As the evening progressed, the couple continued to make Ruth feel at home. They offered her a cozy guest room to stay in, ensuring she had everything she needed. Ruth was grateful for their hospitality and kindness, feeling fortunate to have found such a welcoming home. What Ruth didn't know was that Mrs. Grace had her own plans. Grace and Mark had long dreamed of becoming parents, but Grace was unable to have a child of her own. She had earlier suggested adoption, but Mark declined, pointing, "He can birth children and wants his own children." Grace had thought of a possible surrogate, but fate brought her and Ruth together. But rather than asking her directly, she made a secret plan. Early morning of the following day, Grace woke her husband from sleep. "Honey," she began, "this is the time to take action." "What action do you mean?" Mark asked. "This is the best time for us to have our own child. Since I can't get pregnant, I brought Ruth so you can get her pregnant. Then, when she birthed the child, we can adopt him properly and pay her off. Are you all right? Can you hear yourself? This is a helpless child, for crying out loud. Please, I can't do such thing," said Mark. But Grace wasn't ready to accept any excuse. She was determined to take the golden opportunity presented to her. So she succeeded in convincing her husband to do her will. Ruth was treated like a princess in the house, that she began to wonder what she did to deserve the pampering. Every morning, the driver would take her to school and bring her back in the evening. After a few months, Grace reminded her husband he hasn't done as they agreed, and she was becoming impatient. So each night, Mark would sneak into Ruth's room and beg her to sleep with him. Ruth, however, felt deeply uncomfortable with the idea and repeatedly refused Mark's advances. She valued their friendship and Grace's trust too much to agree to such an arrangement. As the nights passed, Mark grew more insistent, desperate to achieve their dream. Eventually, his desperation turned to threats. He warned Ruth that if she didn't comply, he would send her out of his house. Ruth was horrified by Mark's ultimatum, feeling trapped between her relationship with Grace and her own safety and comfort. She knew she had to find a way to break free from the situation and protect herself from Mark's unwanted advances. But Mark wasn't ready to let her decide anymore, so he forced himself on her. It didn't stop that day. He did it repeatedly. 2 months after the incidents, Ruth started experiencing fatigue and unexplained morning illness. Sensing that their plan had worked, Grace suggested that they take Ruth to the hospital to find out what was wrong with her. Though her intentions were far from pure, she presented the idea as a concerned person, and Ruth agreed to go. Grace drove Ruth to the hospital, where they met with a doctor to run tests and determine the cause of Ruth's illness. After a few minutes of waiting, the doctor returned with the results. Ruth was pregnant. Grace remained composed as she listened to the doctor. Ruth began shedding tears, scared that Grace might start insisting on knowing who got her pregnant. But to her utmost surprise, Grace assured her that she would be there to support her through the process, all while secretly reveling in the success of her scheme. The news brought mixed emotions to Ruth, as she had not planned for a pregnancy at this point in her life. Little did she know that the person she trusted most was the very one who had orchestrated her suffering. Grace and Mark, on the other hand, were delighted by the news. Their plan had worked perfectly. They had orchestrated Ruth's pregnancy without her knowledge. As Ruth's pregnancy progressed, Grace started to gather baby items, overjoyed that she was soon going to be a mother. Ruth's journey through pregnancy had been a challenging but rewarding experience. As the 9 months came to a close, anticipation filled the air. Finally, the day arrived when Ruth gave birth to a bouncing baby boy. The room was filled with joy and love as the nurse placed the newborn in Ruth's arms. Ruth was overcome with emotion as she looked into her son's eyes for the first time. The moment was magical, and Ruth felt a profound sense of connection to the tiny life she had carried for 9 months. Mark was happy to meet his new baby. He had been by Ruth's side throughout her pregnancy, apologizing for his wrong deed, supporting and encouraging her. When he finally got to hold the baby boy, his heart melted. Mark held the baby gently, his eyes filled with awe and tenderness. Grace couldn't stop smiling as she touched the baby's soft cheek, her heart swelling with happiness. Grace approached Ruth with a hopeful smile, but the conversation she was about to have weighed heavily on her mind. She knew this was a delicate topic, one that could change all their lives forever. As they sat down at a small table in a quiet corner of the room, Grace took a deep breath and began. Ruth, I've been thinking a lot about your situation, Grace started gently. I know how tough it must be, facing an unexpected pregnancy and the challenges that come with it. I want to help you, and I believe my husband and I could provide a loving home for your child. Ruth looked at her warily, not sure of what she meant and where the conversation was headed. What are you suggesting? She asked, her voice cautious. Grace leaned closer, her expression earnest. We'd like to adopt your child. You wouldn't have to worry about the financial burden. We would make sure you are paid handsomely so you can get the best education. It would be a win-win situation for everyone. Ruth's eyes widened slightly at the suggestion. You want to pay me off to give you my baby? She asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice. Grace quickly shook her head. No, it's not like that. We just want to support you through this, and in return, we'd be able to give your child a stable, loving home. We would take on the responsibility of raising the child. Ruth's expression hardened, and she pushed back in her seat. I'm not selling my baby, she said firmly. I appreciate your offer, but this is my child we're talking about. I can't just give them up for money or a so-called better life. Grace could see that she had struck a nerve. She tried to backtrack. Ruth, I didn't mean it that way. We're just trying to find a way to help you and provide for the child. If there's anything else we can do to support you, please let us know. Ruth's gaze softened slightly, but she remained resolute. Thank you for the offer, but this isn't something I can just decide right now. It's my child, and I need to figure out what's best for him. And my dad is not aware I have a baby. I don't know how he would react knowing I gave birth to a baby, but still, I don't think I can sell off my own baby. She began shedding tears. Grace nodded, understanding that she couldn't push Ruth any further. Of course, Ruth, take your time. Just know that we're here to help you and to make sure your baby live a better life. Ruth gave her a faint smile. Thanks, I appreciate that. With that, the conversation shifted, and Grace knew she needed to give Ruth the space and time to make her own decision. Grace's anger simmered as she confronted her husband, Mark. Her gaze was intense, her voice laced with frustration. Mark, why didn't you come with me to talk to Ruth about adopting her son? Grace demanded. We planned this together. You knew how important it was for us to present a united front. Mark took a moment to collect his thoughts, his expression serious. Grace, I understand why you're upset. I should have been there with you, but I thought it would be better if you spoke to her alone first, given your close relationship with her. Grace shook her head, her frustration evident. But that wasn't the plan, Mark. We were supposed to approach her together, to show her that this was a joint decision. Now it feels like you left me to handle it all by myself. Mark stepped closer to Emily, his tone sincere. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to leave you on your own. I was trying to respect the bond you have with Ruth and not overwhelm her. But I can see now that I made a mistake. Grace's anger began to wane as she listened to Mark's explanation. While his intentions may have been good, his decision had still upset her. I appreciate your intentions, Mark, but this was something we were supposed to do together, she said, her voice softening. It's important for Ruth to see us as a team, and for us to show her how much we care about her son. Mark nodded. You're right. I should have been there with you. Grace had tried everything to convince Ruth that she and her husband could provide a better life for her child, but Ruth had been firm in her decision to keep the baby. despite the challenges she might face as a single mother with limited resources. Grace's initial hopes of adding a child to their family had quickly dissolved into resentment and frustration. Grace's husband, Mark, entered the room, his expression a mix of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, sitting down beside her. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I just thought we could use her to have our own baby. But now I feel like we've lost everything." Mark placed his hand on Grace's shoulder, offering a comforting touch. "I know this is hard, but we have to respect her decision. It's her child, and we can't change that. It's time for Ruth and her son to leave my house. The main purpose which I brought her to our home didn't work anymore, so there's no need of her staying here." Mark was furious at the idea of Ruth and her son leaving the house. He made it clear that he would not tolerate such a decision. He felt a deep responsibility as the biological father of the child and believed he should have a say in his son's upbringing. "Ruth is not going anywhere with my son." Mark's voice was firm and intense. "They can't just leave this house and start begging on the streets. What kind of life would that be for my child?" Then he left in anger. Meanwhile, Ruth heard their conversation while passing through the door. As Mark came out from the room, he saw Ruth shedding tears and got close to her. "I know why you are crying, but I want to assure you that all will be well." Ruth tried to explain why it would be better she leaves the house with her child, but Mark wouldn't hear of it. He was worried about the safety and well-being of their son, and knew that living outside his house would be dangerous and unstable. He also worried about Ruth's well-being and didn't want her to face such hardships. "We'll figure something out," Mark said. "You can stay here in the house. I don't agree with Grace's decision to send you away. We'll deal with her later, but for now, you and our son need to stay here where it's safe." Ruth was torn. She didn't want to disobey Grace, but she also knew Mark was right about the risks of leaving the house. She appreciated his protective instincts for their son and the offer to stay, but she also knew there would be challenges ahead if they stayed in the house under Grace's orders. Grace's anger was evident as she confronted Mark in their living room. Her voice trembled with frustration as she said, "Mark, I can't take this anymore. If Ruth stays in this house, I will leave. You have to choose between me and her. It's not fair to expect me to live under the same roof with her." Mark, on the other hand, seemed resolute. He stood his ground and looked directly into Grace's eyes. "Grace, I know you're upset, but I can't just abandon Ruth. She's been through so much, and she needs a stable home right now. If you can't accept that, then I'm sorry, but I can't force her to leave. If she leaves, then I might as well leave too because I can't let her down." The tension in the room was palpable as they stood facing each other, each holding their ground. Grace was torn between her love for Mark and her deep-seated resentment about Ruth. Mark was equally conflicted, not wanting to lose Grace but determined to stand by Ruth. Finally, Grace let out a sigh of frustration. "This isn't fair, Mark. You know how I feel about this, but you just don't care. You're willing to risk everything for her." Mark shook his head. "That's not true, Grace. I'm trying to do what's right for both of you. Ruth needs us now more than ever. Can't we find a way to make this work?" The conversation ended with neither of them backing down. The rift between them seemed to grow deeper, leaving the future of their relationship uncertain. Both knew that a resolution needed to be found, but neither could see a clear path forward. Ruth sat in her small, dimly lit room trying to gather her thoughts. Her mind raced back and forth between her current predicament and the memories of her past. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she thought of her child and the life she wanted to provide for him. Returning to her father's home was a fleeting thought that she quickly dismissed. The painful memories of her stepmother's coldness and disdain for her were still fresh in her mind. She remembered the harsh words and the lack of support she received during her time there. The idea of subjecting herself and her child to such an environment was unbearable. Ruth felt trapped, with no clear path forward. She had no one to turn to for help or guidance. The loneliness weighed heavily on her heart, and tears filled her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, trying to be strong for her baby's sake. Grace's regret and self-blame weighed heavily on her as she thought about her past actions. She remembered her time in school when she faced a difficult decision. The abortion she had. While it seemed like the right choice at the time, but ended up damaging her womb, haunted her now. If she had not made that decision, perhaps she would have been able to give her husband a child, and they wouldn't be in this predicament. Her mind wandered to Ruth, the young woman she had seen as a vulnerable, helpless child she could manipulate into carrying a child for her, and her husband had disappointed her. Grace's guilt intensified as she realized how wrong she had been. Manipulating Ruth had only led to more pain and suffering for everyone involved. Grace wished she could go back and change her past choices, but she knew that wasn't possible. All she could do now was face the consequences of her actions and try to make amends where she could. She knew she had hurt not only herself, but also Ruth, her husband, and their entire lives with her decisions. As she sat in her thoughts, she vowed to find a way to make things right and move forward in a more honest and compassionate way. After a long period of contemplation, Grace decided it was time to move forward with her life. She arranged and handed divorce papers to Mark. Taken aback, Mark tried to convince her that they could still work things out. He spoke passionately about the good times they had shared and the future they could still have together. But Grace's mind was made up. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine, Mark," she said firmly. "We've been growing apart for a long time. It's time for both of us to move on." Mark pleaded with her to reconsider, suggesting they could attend counseling or try a trial separation. But Grace remained resolute. She had thought long and hard about this decision and knew it was the right choice for her well-being. Despite Mark's persistent attempts to change her mind, Grace held her ground. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, and soon their marriage was officially over. While it was a painful process, Grace felt a sense of relief and liberation once everything was finalized. After the divorce, Grace decided to take a bold step in her life. She made plans to travel out of the country, seeking a fresh start and new experiences. She packed her bags, said her goodbyes, and set off on her journey. Mr. Adam was surprised and furious when he saw Ruth, his daughter, with a child. Ruth apologized to her dad for keeping such a huge secret from him, and Mark apologized for everything that happened and assured Mr. Adams that he would take good care of his daughter if he allowed him to marry her properly. Mr. Adams' anger subsided after Evelyn, his wife, convinced him to allow Mark marry Ruth, since they already have a child together. Mark and Ruth's wedding was a joyful celebration that united their families and friends in a harmonious gathering. The ceremony was held in Mr. Adams' house, which was beautifully decorated with flowers and soft lights. After the ceremony, Mark and Ruth settled into their life together as a married couple. They supported each other through life's ups and downs, cherishing the special bond they shared. Over the years, their love grew even stronger. Mark made sure Ruth finished her education, and they birthed 2 more children, both of whom brought immense joy to the household. Mark was a loving and devoted father, and Ruth was a nurturing and caring mother. Together, they raised their children with love, teaching them the values of kindness, respect, and family unity.